You're welcome back. The International Monetary Fund, as the IMF, has projected that Nigeria's total public debt will rise steadily to 44.2% of the GDP by 2027, adding that the total fiscal spending of the general government, that's the federal and state government, will widen to 6.4% of the GDP this year, 2022, and that's from 6.0% last year. According to the Debt Management Office, national public debt rose by 20% year-on-year to 39.56 trillion last year. It went up from 32.92 trillion in the previous year. Also, at the end of September 2021, debt servicing to revenue ratio stood at 76%. That means that 76 kobo out of every 1 naira earned by the government is spent on servicing debts. Well, to help us understand what this costs you and what it costs your pocket, we have Assistant Professor Olabisi Akinkugbe, is a co-convener of African Sovereign Debt Justice Network, and he joins us from Halifax. Good morning, Bisi. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
So we talked a lot about this last year, and we keep talking about it. And one of the defense is that Nigeria is still within the limits of 40% of, that's 22.47% when you talk about debt to GDP ratio. But IMF disagrees, stating that the nation's debt to ratio, even though it's still within 40%, but it calls for concern. How do you see this from your network?
Thank you very much. The IMF's concern is an interesting one, and it's one that borders on three potential issues. One is the fact that issues around debt has significant challenges when it comes to transparency. Number two is that circumstances of hidden debts have crept up around African states. If we look at the Mozambique situation that happened last year. Number three is about the fact that we just don't know how much debts are there from private creditors. So if you put these three issues together, you can understand why, from the point of view of, for example, the IMF, there are concerns about Nigeria's current debt profile.
Why should Nigerians be concerned about this? What's it costing Nigerians? I mean, we might as well just take this as one of those government conversation and leave it at that corner. So why should the average Nigerian be concerned about this?
Yeah, thanks. The average Nigerian has to be concerned about it because Nigeria's debt profile has direct capacity or direct implication on the capacity of the Nigerian government to deliver on its other economic and social goods. For example, public health. The past 2 years has shown the need, for example, in the health sector, for a very reliable infrastructure that is well-financed, that the citizens can rely on. So it means if the government's debt level continues to rise, the capacity of the Nigerian government to deliver its health infrastructure promises is significantly compromised. You can also look at the transport sector, for example. Yes, we have made some gains with respect to our railroads, with respect to fixing some of those old roads and building new ones. But the capacity to continue to develop on these are significantly hindered.
And, well, the government borrows for infrastructure because, I mean, then it becomes a question of how do we get out of this cycle? So if the government borrows for infrastructure, shouldn't that give hope that we will get out of it?
Well, thank you. I think you've just hit the very important part of this conversation, which is almost a cyclical way that not only Nigeria, but many other developing countries around the world are trapped in this debt profile. The amount of surcharges that are levied on the capacity, on the loans, the payments that have to be made to service them significantly trump the capacity of the states to get out of the payment. As you're saying, there is more that's been added at the top of the news The DMO, that's the Debt Management Office, has projected an increase in our debt profile. So we're really in a dire situation with respect to our loan profile, and the capacity to really get out is one that requires radical solution. That is what we have called for in our recent statement that we released prior to the beginning of the spring meetings of the World Bank and the IMF.
We would like to hear some of those radical approach that you're talking about.
Well, thank you very much. Well, they're significantly planned around four ideas that really drive a lot of what we do. Number one is that at the international level, the voices of African states, like their fellow developing states, have been marginalized. Therefore, there's important need to, number one, rethink the governance mechanism of the World Bank to give enough room for African states to be at the table. And number two is that in relation to the IMF, its quota system needs to be revised significantly to account for the states to be on the table as well. Number three relates to the general role. We think that special drawing rights, these are mechanisms that have been put in place by the IMF, needs to be administered in a way that puts the interests of developing countries at the table. But number four, which really all connects to the fact that the international system that African states, Nigeria, and others are in today were created at a time when they were really not there. These are institutions that were created in 1941 and 1944 circa. So it means a lot of these states were under colonization at the time. And it means we need a radical international restructuring of the architecture that really controls our international financial regime in a way that centers the interests of these states, that puts them at the table for the negotiation of their own interests. That's number one. Number two is that at the African level, there's the African peer review mechanism. About a month or two ago, they announced that they were also starting an African peer review mechanism. That is important because the review mechanism has direct impact on the capacity of a state to borrow and to stabilize its economy. And so it matters that, out of the poor ratings we've seen in the past year, particularly the Ghanaian finance minister coming out and calling for the restructuring of the international financial architecture. Thirdly, is at the national level. The legal mechanism that governments have in place in African states is still very challenging. There are issues around transparency, accountability, and gaps in the legal regimes. We think that at these three levels, we need to drive the consciousness, and that's what we're doing with the activities of the African Sovereign Debt Justice Network that has various arms to its activities.
All right. Well, there are also those who have talked about federal government seeking a debts moratorium. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, so that's interesting. If you think about this as a temporary measure to dealing with the challenges we have at hand, then that works. But what we have called for, which is the other part of the radical changes, is actually debt cancellation. We need a clean slate for these states to really thrive. It's a really challenging situation that the pandemic of the past 2 years has thrown us in. Prior to the pandemic, things were dire. Now it's worse. And so debt cancellation is an important strategy for Africans that we at the AFSDJ and our collaborators really think African states need to put at the table.
But we had that clean slate and then we made the mess of it again. So why don't we deal with our issues? Why do we always have to go out there to, isn't there something we can do looking inwards? We had a clean slate once.
And you are right. You see, that's number one, the complex nature of this hydra-headed monster. It is similar to that. But, I've mentioned or alluded to the national challenges. I've alluded to the transparency gap. I've alluded to the legal frameworks that are not there. Corruption, unfortunately, it's a very terrible thing. And so even at the national level, when governments borrow, we do not know how those loans are administered. That is a challenge. And so our aim at the AFSDJ is not just to point at the international. We believe a simultaneous process at the national, regional, and international level is what we need. We need those accountability mechanisms to be set up. We need a review mechanism like the one that the UNCTAD is spearheading to be supported, to really monitor and to think about the debt at the international level. But also at the national level, we do need our legislative houses to do their work. We do need the state legislative houses to do their work, to monitor really how the executive administers these loans that they procure.
And then there's also the call to reduce cost of governance.
That is a real thing, right? At the end of the day, you do find that a lot of the loans that are gotten or procured really go to really keeping the government afloat. And that's because we have a bloated regime of governance. It's not the first time Nigeria, by the way, has addressed these issues. The call to trim down Nigeria's governance, robust governance architecture has been on the table. I think it is one way. It goes a long way in addressing some of the issues, but it doesn't really go quite as far as addressing some of these fundamental issues. They are baked into the structure, into the mechanism of governance that we have in Nigeria. They are baked into the regulatory regime of international governance. By the baked in, actually, I'm talking about the inequality regime, the way in which the states are not able to address them. So for Nigeria, if the country really is able to trim down the cost of governance, that would be great, but transparency also remains key in other areas.
All right, so if the projection of the IMF, which is that by the end of this year, 2022, that Nigeria was spending as much as 92.6% of its revenue to service debt, if it actually comes to be, could you paint a picture of what direct and indirect impact this will have on Nigerians?
Oh, thank you very much. Well, it's hard. It means, for example, that for the average Nigeria, the government, number one, may not be able to do anything about the state of our road infrastructure. Number two, it means the government may not have any fiscal space to really create any new economic-driven jobs, right, that it might want to support. Number four, it means, areas such as, again, I emphasize, health sector will be significantly compromised. This really cripples the capacity of the government to meet those basic needs and services that you and I as Nigerians need. The socioeconomic rights that you will need to enjoy as otherwise, housing, security, amongst other issues, are significantly compromised.
And, well, doesn't look like there's anything a Nigerian can do except we just keep talking about it.
Oh, no, there's a lot. That's one part of it. It's to ask questions. You see, we are running a democratic governance regime, and it is great to see a lot of politicians trying to uphold the ethos of democratic governance. We need to ask questions. We need to ask questions not just of our leaders in Abuja, not just of those at the Senate. We need to ask of the local government chairpersons, the LCDAs, the legislative houses at the state assembly, and then the governors. We need to make them accountable at this time, particularly that Nigeria is going through an election cycle. It is an important conversation that we need to put on the table. Quite apart from that, though, citizen advocacy groups have been doing a lot of work. We need to know the terms on which the loans that are procured, are being given. We don't see them. And that's a challenge to the extent that these things are, secret, hived off, and then we don't have adequate information to really assess what the citizens need. So the citizens have a lot to do. We talk, but we ask questions, and we can do public interest litigation. That's another aspect. That's the one that brought out the Mozambique situation. And so there are organizations, civil societies that are doing this in a respectful, meaningful way. And our work in AFSDGN, in terms of research, is geared towards really supporting those kinds of initiatives as well.
All right. Thank you so much, Olabisi Akinkugbe, Co-Convener of African Sovereign Debt Justice Network. We will keep asking questions. At least that's what I'm paid to do. I'll keep doing that. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you.